40. Okay. So when we talk about body composition, the actual thing that we're referring to is whatever the chemical and biological makeup is of your body. Okay. So we want to know in some ways how much water does Ramsey have in her body? How much protein? How much lipid? How much sodium or potassium or something like that? Okay, that's truly what we're trying to get to out at the end of all of these things. Okay, is what's happening from that standpoint. All right. Let me ask a question before we kind of dive too far into what this is. Okay. Nikki, when I say body composition, what pops into your head? Do you think of, oh, it's the chemical or anatomical makeup? Probably not. What do you actually think of? BMI. Okay. What's BMI? You said you think of BMI. So like what is, you asked that in the wrong way. Somebody's weight. Okay. Okay. Emma, what do you think of when I say body composition? What pops into your head? Just the first thing.
Percentage of like muscle and fat. Size.
Okay, percentage of muscle and fat as it relates to body size. Okay. Okay. Good. Good. McKenna, anything else you think of when I say body composition? Covered it, okay. BMI, weight, percentage of fat, percentage of muscle. Okay. So that's the most common thing that people are going to think of, right? They don't think like, oh, well, my body composition is actually whatever it is that I'm made up of, right? Biochemically, I am this and this and this. What most people think of is how much do I weigh? And they probably don't even think in some ways about how much muscle do I have? How much fat do I have? They probably think, right, what do my muscles look like? Or something like that. They think of appearance, right? This person looks muscular, or this person doesn't look particularly muscular, right? This person is totally rocking a dad bod or whatever. That's probably what people are thinking, okay? So we'll get into a little bit of what those things are, where they come from, what all of that means today, okay? But I also want you guys to know and understand that one of the things that body composition tells us, though, is your nutritional status. And as it relates to all of that, it's going to give us as well some information about your overall well-being, overall health. Okay? We're going to get into kind of the differences from a health standpoint of sort of chemical makeup, weight, fat, muscle, and the like. That's going to go in. Okay. All right. So probably the best place to start is with what Nikki brought up, which is BMI. Okay. We're going to start with a thing that is not body composition. Okay. And yet it's probably the most widely used measurement to assess obesity, weight status, health status. And we'll talk a little bit in a few minutes about why that's going to be the case. Okay. So the thing that we're gonna talk about is the body mass index, or BMI. Okay. BMI is really a measure of size. Okay. In some ways, it's almost a measure of the volume or the area in the world that you occupy, right? BMI is weight divided by height squared. So basically, how much do you weigh based upon how tall you are, okay? It does not make any distinction, okay? Any distinction whatsoever between being what we might refer to as overweight or having a larger weight, a higher weight, versus being what some people might call overfat or overly adipose tissue, okay? what it is going to do is basically just say, well, you might have more muscle or more water or more bone that will make your weight go up, or you might have excess adipose tissue that will also make your weight go up. It does not make any distinction between those two things. It treats all body tissues as though they are equal from a health standpoint. And we know that's not the case. We know that's not the case. Okay. If we look at some data, and we had one of my graduate students looked into a little bit of this last year, and I should probably have shown some of her stuff, that if we look in very, very large cohorts of data, body fatness or percent body fat, actual body composition, assessed via, say, a DEXA scan that we'll talk about later, it's kind of very accurate measure, and BMI are only very weakly related. Okay, they're only very weakly related. And so what that tells us is that BMI's definition of obesity is really just, I weigh more than what someone might have expected for what my height is. And it doesn't tell us anything about, well, what is that weight made up of? Is it muscle tissue? Is it bone? Is it fat? Is it water? And each of those things will have some sort of a different impact on health. Additionally, the relationship between body fatness or body composition and BMI is very different across different groups. Okay? If we look at BMI and percent body fat in folks that are y'all's age, it looks very different than if we look at it in people that are my age or people that are maybe, say, your grandparents' age. Okay? Because of some very predictable age-related changes in body composition, in fat mass and muscle mass and those things, then the relationship is going to be different. It treats men and women as the same from a weight and body composition standpoint, and we know for a fact y'all are not the same. Okay, you're not the same. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. It also treats people that do resistance training, so weight trained or resistance trained people, as being the same as non-weight trained individuals. This is also not going to be the case. If you have lots of muscle mass, because you do resistance training, because genetically that's just sort of what you have, right? Then you're going to have a higher BMI than someone that might actually have more excess adipose tissue than you, but they don't weigh as much because they don't have as much muscle. So it doesn't make any distinctions here as well. So all of these things can introduce some error and some problems with kind of what BMI is going to tell us. Despite all of its problems, okay, I will readily admit BMI is a terrible measure, except it correlates to every health outcome that we can possibly think of. Okay, it's a bad measure of body composition, but as you weigh more for your height, it seems that your risk of basically every chronic disease you've ever come across is going to go up. So it's useful in that way. It tells us some things. We also have huge troves of data on BMI and health outcomes, because I can call you guys on the phone, or I could send Devin a text and say, hey, tell me your height, tell me your weight, tell me if you have cardiovascular disease, right? That Devin knows. If I said, Devin, do you have a DEXA scan lately? Do you know what your percent body fat is? Do you know what your bone mineral density is? Do you have any idea what those things are? No, of course not, right? And so when we try to collect data in these large cohorts, it's easy to get BMI. It's much more difficult to get an accurate measure of body composition. You guys will all do a capstone project someday. I'm not sure, a minor. There's one of you guys in class that's a minor. You do a capstone project. You can get BMI from everybody if you want as part of your capstone project. What's your height? What's your weight? Tell me how active you are. Tell me whatever. All those things. Really easy to get. Okay. We don't need special equipment. You don't need special training. Easy to get. So we have lots of this data, which that also is going to be. It's going to be present. Okay. So that's BMI. All right. So Here's a rough thing in looking at BMI. I don't really know or understand why we have an anatomically incorrect fellow who is here, but this is the picture that came out of the book that we were using. So here we have what we might consider sort of a normal kind of body mass index, less than 25 kilograms per meter squared. I guess I should note that when you calculate your BMI, which we will do for lab 3, you take your body weight in kilograms and you divide it by your height in meters squared. That's kind of what the units are going to be. Under 25 is considered normal. It's really 17.5 to 25 or 24.99 are normal. If you're under 17.5, usually we get maybe one person a year that's under 17.5, you're considered to be underweight. This is normal. You're the reference category for our disease risk. Here is a person that is overweight, okay, 25 to 29. You can note in our overweight fellow, he is not overweight necessarily because he is super duper muscular, because he's done a lot of resistance training. We're just in some ways kind of edging ourselves out into a little bit of a softer kind of dad bod look here. And then obese is if you are greater than or equal to 30 kilogram meters squared as we kind of go our way out here. And you will note that we have the very kind of prototypical male, what we would call android excess body fat kind of here around the stomach, kind of small legs. This dad's not doing a lot of squats or anything, but he's kind of got a beer belly here. And we'll talk a little bit more about why this particular deposition of fat is really, really bad or very kind of dangerous as we go a little farther along there. Okay, that's kind of what this is all gonna look like. Okay, this is gonna show you again an illustration of we have two guys. They're both 5'11", okay, and they both have the same BMI of 30.7. So they're both 5'11" and weigh 220 pounds. But our guy on the left is a bodybuilder, let's just say, lots of muscle mass, okay? And then our guy on the right, not so much bodybuilder, right? So you can look at these two. They have the exact same BMI. They are both obese by BMI. But if we were to guess on these two, that the guy on the right that has what we would imagine is more adipose tissue and less muscle mass compared to our bodybuilder, this person is probably going to be at a heightened risk or a higher risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, certain kinds of cancers, everything you could think of, than the guy here on the left. So this is just a kind of a further illustration that BMI doesn't capture everything, okay? It doesn't capture everything. But if we look at thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, the majority of them are going to not necessarily be bodybuilders or even this. We kind of end up in the middle somewhere, and that is why it tends to be a reasonably good kind of measure. So these two things are we have to keep those things in mind. Okay. Okay. To talk about body comp, remember, it's what are you made up of? Okay, what are you made up of? What is it that Kathy is made up of? How much of her is muscle? How much is what we're going to call essential fat, non-essential fat, bone, and then basically everything else, which are going to be other organs. Included in the muscle and the organs is going to be water. Okay, so if we look at this, this is very, very general, okay, very general of a kind of average college age individual. I would argue that given some of the shifts in our demographics and shifts in sort of sedentary behaviors and those things, that we are probably overestimating muscle and underestimating adipose tissue in average person nowadays. Here we have it, okay? So who decides that this is healthy body composition? I don't have a fucking clue. I don't really know. We know that health is going to really be driven in both of these people, somewhat by body composition, somewhat by their muscle tissue and non-essential fat tissue, but also really by other lifestyle factors, physical activity, smoking behaviors, okay, those kinds of things. So if we look, though, some things I hope jump out at you, okay? What we are going to see is that in a very general sense, the average man tends to have about 10% more muscle mass than the average woman, and the average woman tends to have about 10% more essential fat and then a little bit more non-essential fat compared to the average guy. Okay. Now, anybody know what essential fat is? And if I say essential fat, what does essential mean to you? I'm sorry, can you say that again, please? Healthier fat. Okay. Okay. Madison, is breathing essential to you?
Yes.
Okay, so what does that mean?
You need it to like live.
I need it to live. Okay, very good. And so Lana says healthier fat. That's we're kind of there, but we need it to be healthy, but we need it so that we don't die. Okay. So these are just estimates. Okay, these are just estimates. We have no way of knowing what the essential fat that Matt needs in order to stay alive. To do that, it's October, we've now entered into a horror movie. We're in a Saw movie or something now. We have to starve Matt all the way down until he loses basically all of this fat until we figure out how little fat he has until he dies. Okay? That's how we would know. So these are really estimates. I assume no one is volunteering for that experiment. But we assume in men, an essential fat is maybe 3 or 4%. We assume in women it's about 12. Okay? We assume it's about 12. Above and beyond all of this, then there is going to be non-essential fat, which we all have some. This is what we normally think of probably as most of our subcutaneous fat that we'll talk about when we do lab and those things. But that's my flabby tricep that's waving at you. Okay, that's what this non-essential fat in some ways is. You can lose some of this, and your health would otherwise be perfectly fine. Why do you all think women have more essential fat than men? Daniel, you have any ideas? So you're right, that is a difference in their body composition, but why? Why is that just inherently the way that it is? Devin? Yes. Sorry, ladies, you have to carry children, which some of you may enjoy. My wife didn't mind it until the very, very end, where our daughter had her butt wedged up under her rib cage in some ways. And so, but then her head was on my wife's bladder, and you got to pee all the time. I mean, there's some, there's some good, there's some bad, right? But the big thing is that evolutionarily, women need more fat, so there's greater energy stores in case you get pregnant, so that you can hopefully carry a child to term, right? Think about evolution. In a lot of ways, it's about survival. It's about passing on your genetics to the next generation. And so that's a really, really kind of conserved thing that we see in a lot of instances. Okay? Ladies, and some of you may have had this particular experience, ladies, if your body fat gets too low, you will become what we call amenorrheic. You will stop having your period. Okay? And that is because the body is worried that you don't have enough stored energy to be able to support carrying the child to term. So you'll become amenorrheic. This is very, very common in female athletes. It's very common in female distance athletes and soccer players, folks that run a huge amount and may not get enough nutrients, but then may also sort of lose weight. There's something called the female athlete triad, eating disorders. There's a whole host of things that are potentially very unhealthy that can kind of get wrapped up in the midst of all of this. Okay? So that's kind of where we're going to be. One of the things that you guys will see, and I'll show this to highlight this a little bit later on, is we have BMI ranges for normal weight, underweight, overweight, obese, and kind of how that correlates to different health things. We don't really have that for percent body fat, right? So you guys are going to do some stuff in our lab. You're going to get an estimate of your percent body fat and your muscle mass. And you may ask me, Dr. Black, well, is this good? Is this bad? Like, where am I in all of this? I'm just going to throw my hands up and say, I don't know. We don't have data. Why we don't have data baffles me. Because there's a lot of data out there. Why we don't haven't put it all together, I'm not sure. Okay. But we'll look at these things. And so we'll just kind of say an average college-age guy is probably going to have a percent body fat somewhere in the mid to high teens. The average woman, college-age woman, is going to have a percent body fat somewhere between 25 and 35, which may seem like a lot to everyone. Guys may think that seems like a lot. Ladies, y'all may think that that seems like a lot, but it's really not very much. Okay? It's really not very much. I will ask one of my former master's students if I can use a picture of her and show you guys, and we'll talk about DEXA and kind of what these numbers are going to be. You all would look at her and think she is very, very lean, very muscular. She was a soccer player in college, and until very recently, she was an Orange Theory instructor. And you would look at her and think she has no extra body fat. And yet when she does a DEXA, she's at like 21% body fat. So I would show all of that in an effort to hopefully kind of assuage everyone to be like, oh my gosh, look at this. I've got 27. I'm like, yeah, but like women that are under 15, you have essentially no body fat, like none whatsoever in that way. Okay, women, if y'all are under 20, really, you have almost no extra body fat whatsoever. If you ever hear guys say, oh, I've got 2% body fat, that's bullshit. Okay, crap. Guys that are under 10 on the DEXA have essentially no body fat whatsoever. None in the midst of all of those kinds of things. So everybody's going to get a number, and they're going to tend to be, depending upon where you are and what method it's going to be, they're probably going to generally underestimate because that makes people feel better about themselves, which that's okay. All right, so that's just kind of what we're looking at here. All right, that's what we're looking at. I should have warned you. On the next slide, there is a dissection of the cadaver and the mouse. So if that is going to be a thing that is going to upset you, please close your eyes. Okay? So the way that we want to assess body composition, okay, the best way to know all of this, all right, if I want to know what McKenna is made up of, again, it's October, horror movie, we have to kill her and then dissect her, cut out every tissue that she has, weigh every one of those tissues, and then we should probably take all of those and burn them to see how many calories of energy they're going to release to kind of get a good quantification, okay? The single best measure of body composition is an anatomical dissection, okay? An anatomical dissection. If you had anatomy here, you've done that. You guys dissect, in like zoo or something, do y'all dissect frogs or mice or rats or anything like that? Did a rat? Okay. So those are going to be the things that we're going to have. But you can just sort of cut them open, you can pull out the individual organs, you can pull out the muscle, you weigh all of those different kinds of things. And so what you can see on the left here is, and these mice are some very kind of distinct ones. Dr. Vellers might know sort of what we should name these black 6 mice or, pardon, are they? Yeah. Okay. You know that just from looking at them? Yes, I do. Okay. So there's some very distinct genetic lines of mice that are always bred. They're genetically in many ways identical. So we can do research on them. But there's things that are called black 6 mice. There's bulb C mice. I don't know, whatever the mice are. We don't do animal research here. But our one on the left is pretty lean. The one on the right, you will note, right, has some fat deposition kind of down here. He's got a little dad paunch right there on those kinds of things. And then here you can see we have our 2 gentlemen. The one on the left is very, very lean. And then the one on the right has all of this extra, right? You will note subcutaneous adipose tissue here right under the skin, but also note all of this extra adipose tissue that's going to be sort of in and around their internal organs and things and along the back and all of that, okay? And so part of the subcutaneous fat is going to have some poor health consequences, but the stuff that is in and around, especially around the liver and the stomach and your intestines here in the middle, called visceral fat, is going to be particularly dangerous and really increase your risk of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Okay. So assuming none of you want to volunteer to let us dissect, we'll come back to the dissections and how we use those to help us with other measurements in a minute. Assuming nobody wants to volunteer for that, if we want to know what you're made up of, we've got to find some other method to go about doing this, okay? And so most of the things that we're going to talk about now are called indirect measurements. Indirect. Direct is dissection, indirect is everything else. Okay? Most of our indirect measures are based upon one simple idea. And that idea is called densitometry. Okay? Densitometry. It's based upon something called Archimedes' principle. All right, you guys heard of Archimedes' principle? No hands. Okay. How many of you have gotten into a bathtub at some point in your life? Or a swimming pool? Or a hot tub? Right? Okay. You get in the bathtub and the water rises. You overfill your bathtub and you get in, right? The water will slosh out or it goes down the safety drain, right? Okay. So you get in the pool and you float or you sink. Yes, you've had that particular experience. Okay. This is the idea of densitometry and Archimedes' principle. Okay. Densitometry means that we can figure out a way to assess the density of your body. Okay. So density is mass divided by volume. We know your mass. I can put you on a scale and figure out your mass. All right. Your volume is more difficult to measure. So Archimedes' principle tells us that an object repels water in direct relation to its density, which is also mostly going to be related to its volume in that particular. Okay? So when you get in the bathtub, you move as much water as what your volume is. So if we could capture all of the water that you're moving, put it into a thing, we can measure how much water that is, and that's we can know the volume. Okay? So what we know about different tissues is that muscle, because it is more dense than fat, muscle occupies less space than fat. Here is an estimate of these things trying to show that 5 pounds of fat and 5 pounds of muscle occupy much different volumes. Therefore, they have a much different density. Okay? And so the density of fat is less than water, so fat will float. The density of muscle is more than water, so muscle wants to sink. Okay? So we can look at things when we put you in water, we can see, one, how much water do you displace? But then two, to what extent are you going to be buoyant or not buoyant? And that's going to depend upon the ratio in your body of muscle and bone and things that are more dense than water to your adipose tissue, which is less dense. Okay? So this is one of the problems with BMI. Muscle is more dense than fat. So 5 pounds of muscle and 5 pounds of fat occupy much different volumes in different spaces, and they do very different things to the body also. Okay? All right. So in order to apply densitometry, we first have to try to make a decision on how do we want to partition the different tissues in your body, okay? And the partitioning or the compartments that we're separating out are going to be a little bit different depending upon the measurement tool that we're going to try to use, okay? And so of the kind of commonly employed measures of body composition, they tend to fall into one of these 3 categories. They're going to separate your body tissues into 2 compartments, okay? Those 2 compartments being what we're going to call lipid tissue, okay, and then fat-free mass. Okay? So you're either fat or non-fat. And within that non-fat or that fat-free mass here, okay, we're going to have bone, water, muscle, your internal organs, all of those other things that you're potentially made up of. Okay? So you're basically fat and then everything else. And it makes no distinction on what those everything else are going to be. When you use the 2-compartment model for densitometry, we assume basically a fat-free mass density of 1.1, and we assume, and I've now forgotten what the density of fat is supposed to be, able to look that up. And it's like 0.8 or something like that. So we're going to break it kind of down. And if we know what you weigh, we know how much volume you occupy, we know what your overall body density is, then we can essentially calculate what percentage of you needs to be fat-free and what percentage needs to be fat in order to arrive at that particular density. Okay? And that's going to tell us then you have X amount of fat tissue and X amount of fat-free tissue. As we move up into additional compartments, what's changing is what's happening in your fat-free mass. Okay? In a 3-compartment model, okay, you're going to be lipid tissue, and then what we're going to call lean body mass. Lean body mass is going to be basically protein and water, and then minerals. Okay? Or it's going to be total body water, and then solid tissue, which is minerals and amino acids or minerals and proteins. Now, obviously, these things would not be exactly equal like this. They've just been drawn this way to kind of try to illustrate what you're going to be making up. Okay? We'll talk about one 3-compartment measure. The big 3-compartment measurement really gives us is it tells us about bone mineral density. It's the one that we cover. It tells us about bone mineral density, which is really important, especially for you ladies for later on in life. The most accurate one that we could do, even though it's very rarely done, is called a 4-compartment or a 4-component model, where we're basically going to separate you into fat, total body water, protein from muscles, and minerals from your bones. Okay? And so a 4-compartment model, I'll show you guys, depending upon what it is either going to be very, very time-consuming to collect and analyze, or it's going to require the use of 3 different assessments, all of which are expensive, and then the combination of all of those things to try to arrive at something. Okay? So this is the key thing to remember. When we look at the body compartments to use densitometry, we start off with 2, fat and everything else, which we're going to call fat-free. And then 3 and 4, just chop the fat-free mass up into its individual components to try to be a little bit more accurate. Bones and minerals, the minerals in the bone, calcium, have a different density than water, which have a different density than the protein that's going to be in your muscle. And so if we can measure each of those, then we can get a more accurate picture of what it is that's making up your total body density. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay, cool. All right. So let's start with some imaging techniques to do all of this. So how many of you have ever had an MRI? Okay. Ooh, good, almost everybody. Okay, I'm going to put my hand way up. Okay, so partially from playing baseball my whole life, I have impingement in my throwing shoulder. If anybody wants to care about those kinds of things, if you want to feel what or hear the head of my humerus crunching on the underside of my acromion process. It's called crepitus and things that you can have here, but I can just do this and you can feel it turn and hit the underside of my acromion. Because of that, I've had multiple MRIs. I'll tell you about what a terrible experience I had when we come back from our break today in the midst of all of this. And we did a bunch of MRIs as part of my graduate work. So I've spent like more than a year of my life either in the magnet or analyzing the stupid images, which take a long time. So we've got MRIs, then we have DEXA. Okay, we've got DEXA. Anybody had a DEXA scan? Okay. Emma, did you have it here with us? Were you in somebody's study? With the athletic program. Okay. Okay. Athletics has a DEXA. You have to get a prescription from a physician to get the DEXA over there, which makes no sense to me. Very, very strict. DEXA is an X-ray. We'll talk about that in a minute. DEXA is an X-ray. We have a very strict radiation kind of protocol thing. So, okay, good to know. Of our indirect measures that are based on densitometry, MRI and DEXA are the most accurate ones that we have. Okay, we call these high-resolution imaging techniques. Okay, of the 2 of them, MRI is unquestionably the most accurate one. Unquestionably the most accurate. It's also unquestionably the least feasible of every way we would want to try to quantify body composition in the history of the world. Okay. So those of you guys that said you had an MRI, Matt, you said you had an MRI. Do you mind sharing what you had imaged? Did your knee imaged? Okay. Do you remember about how long you were in the magnet to have your knee imaged? 45 minutes. They're just taking pictures around his knee. Imagine that we need to scan you from the tip of your toes all the way out with your hands up to the tip of your fingers. And we need to get one image slice, basically. Images are typically a half to a centimeter thick. We need to get one of those. So just estimate how tall you are in centimeters, right? I'm like 170 or something centimeters tall. So you have to get 170 slices of meat. Probably more than that, because if I put my arms up, I'm probably like 6'6" or something. Okay? So close to 200 individual slices. So you might be in there all day. You can't move, okay? Or it screws them up. Then some poor sop of a grad student has to take all of those images and go into every image and individually circle each little tissue thing, figure out what it is. You get an image. The image is laid out in these pixels, and each pixel has a certain size to it. So you do a circle, you calculate how many pixels are in that tissue, and you can get an area. From that area, we know we can calculate a volume because we know what this is. We know the density of, okay, this is fat, this is muscle, this is going to have water in it. We know what you are, and we can get a hyper accurate estimate of what your body composition is. But it might take a grad student 6 months to analyze every one of those images. So all day to get it. We've talked about this, right? Have we here? You have $5 million in spare change laying around, invest in building an MRI. Okay, about $3,000 an hour to be in those things is what they bill insurance. If there's any of them in town, they're pretty much used nonstop from dusk till dawn. Okay, they're about $5 grand. So about $5 million to get a nice 3 Tesla GE one. You got to have the right building, so we're thinking maybe another like $6 million. If they're good for forever, if you've got money laying around, let me know. We'll invest. Okay, but we can get this very accurate. Okay. DEXA is an X-ray. So MRI, I'm sure none of you want me to talk about what's called spin physics and how the magnet actually works to put you in a magnetic field that lines all the electrons in your body up. And you shut the magnetic field off and they all recess back to their kind of resting energy state. And we can use all of that to then tell what tissues are what. With DEXA, it's just an X-ray. Okay. DEXAs take, I don't know, 5 or 6 minutes. There's this bar, you lay down on the table, the bar goes across you and back, and it takes the X-ray, and you get images that look like this. Okay, here's what you would think of as a traditional X-ray, where you can see the bones, and then it has this kind of ghosting effect on these your other tissues. You can see the person's lungs, you can see their muscle tissue, you can see their adipose tissue. It makes the distinctions on the X-ray between bone and muscle and fat, and so it can be very accurate. If the sort of error of measurement in MRI is about 1%, DEXA is probably 3 to 4%. So whatever number you get, you're within kind of plus or minus 3 or 4 percentages of those kinds of things. So what has happened with the advent of more people having DEXA scans, DEXA has become the most commonly used way to assess body composition in clinical and research settings. Okay. We will talk about how we do skin folds. If we were having a normal semester, you guys would pinch each other and get your own skin folds, and they would be wildly inaccurate. But you can be if you know what you're doing with the skin folds, you get a pretty good measurement. We don't really do underwater weighing anymore, even though we have a tank downstairs. I call it the Silence of the Lambs tank. You've never seen Silence of the Lambs. It's just a big hole in Dr. Larson's lab. It's like a bathtub, but it's like 12 feet deep. You have to dunk yourself down in there. If you take exercise physiology lab class, you guys will do underwater weighing in that way. So it has its own kind of pluses and minuses. These are going to be this is going to be the most common thing that we're going to do now. It's going to be DEXA. Okay. Other ones that are based upon this, we talked about it. We talked about skin fold. We'll get you guys. I'll show you guys what the individual sites are. Probably later on today would be my guess. But you take these calipers. I'll run down in the break and grab some out of my lab. You take the calipers and you pinch in certain particular locations, and then you measure the thickness of subcutaneous adipose tissue. And then the estimate is then that if you have more subcutaneous fat, you also probably have more fat in the total body. And so we can do some calculations and estimates. There's also a thing called bioelectrical impedance. This may look familiar if you ever go over to the Huff. They have one of these over there. They look super sophisticated. They're really simple, and they're also not very accurate. But biological impedance works by you stand on or you hold on to these little metal things. They run an imperceptible electrical current into one leg. It travels up through your body and gets collected coming out of the other leg. And the amount of time it takes for that current to pass is going to be dependent on how much muscle or really how much water you have in your body versus how much adipose tissue you have. Water conducts electricity, so if you've got more muscle, you've got more water, you have more adipose tissue acts an insulator, it doesn't transmit it as fast. And so from all of this, we can get an estimate. This one is probably plus or minus maybe 6%. You guys will see a little bit later. It tends to underestimate in people that are lean. So it might tell you you're 15% body fat when you're really like 25. And then if you're a person that is a little bit higher, say you're 30% or 40%, it might tell you you're 50. It underestimates on the bottom and it really overestimates on the top end. It tends to be reasonably more accurate on kind of an average everyday person in the middle. So it doesn't work great with a lot of college folks. Okay. The other thing that I said was underwater weighing. So the cool thing about underwater weighing is this is kind of at its most basic. This is truly Archimedes' principle at work. But you get in a big tank of water or a big tub of water, there is a swing that is in that water. You sit on that swing. The swing is connected to a scale, and we figure out with you underwater, how much do you weigh underwater, right? And so people that have more muscle and less fat, we're going to say, here's Dr. Black in college, here's Dr. Black now, in that particular way. These guys are identical. They both weigh 205 pounds. They're both 6'2". Okay, so their BMI is exactly the same, but young Dr. Black weighs more underwater than present Dr. Black because he has more muscle. Okay, so he weighs 6.5 kilograms versus weighing 5 kilograms. And so if we know what these two things are, then we can do some calculations based upon all of this to figure those things out. Okay, so if we know what you weigh under here, we can do some calculations. Again, it's the same general principle. This one is tricky to do. One, because not everybody likes dunking themselves underwater and having to hold their breath for 30 seconds. You also have to try to expel all of the extra air out of your lungs because the air in your lungs provides buoyancy. And so this will think that you have more adipose tissue if you have air trapped in your lungs. And so you have to blow all the air out and then hold your breath for 30 seconds while you're dunked underwater. It's a very kind of disconcerting type of thing, or at least it is for me. In that way. But if you guys want to know about all of that, you can take Dr. Pereira's class, and you guys will get a chance to do all of this. And y'all will then compare that to some other body composition. Okay. We'll do one more and then we'll take a break. The other one that is, it's a densitometry measurement that is kind of fun. And we have this available if you want to use it for your capstone project. It's camped out in one of my secondary lab spaces. We don't have any place else to put it. But it's called air displacement plethysmography. Okay? It's just a big fancy word for we're going to blow some air on you. That's really what it is. Okay? This thing that you see here is called a bod pod. Okay? It's called a bod pod. Looks like an alien like escape pod or something from a spaceship. But what we know is that density is equal to mass divided by volume. Well, through something called Boyle's law, okay, yay, more chemistry and physics, pressure on one side of an object, the ratio of pressure on one side to the other is equal to sort of the volume of the thing that's in between there and the volume of the whole. And so if we know basically your sort of the inside volume of all of this, we can guess at sort of the pressure of air applied on one side of you and then measure the pressure of the air on the other side. We know 3 of these 4 things, we can calculate your volume. Okay? So we put you in here. Ideally, you get in here and you are basically naked with a shower cap on and you've shaved all the hair off of your body. Because any hair is going to catch and change the pressure that's going across there. So you're in here in your Speedo and your shower cap, ready to go swim in the 50-meter freestyle on the Olympics, and we're going to blow air from one side of you and measure it on the other side. Okay. Anybody ever had this done? you guys all have had that. I've never actually done it. I should probably hook it up down there and see what's going to go on. What is it, Madison? What did it feel like? Was it okay? Scary? Was it anything?
No, you're just like sitting there.
Okay.
You like.
How forceful is the air that's being blown on? Not very. Okay. Just like I'm just chilling. I'm just here. Okay.
And it's like quick. It's like 10 seconds.
Okay. Yeah, it doesn't take much because it knows what the air is going to be. Lena, Emma, y'all have the same kind of experience. Not a bad thing, right? Okay. So we can do all of this and we can get an estimate then of what your volume is. If we know your volume, we know your mass, we can calculate your density. And if we know your density, we can make an estimate of your volume. Okay. So again, the thing that looks super sophisticated, but actually takes advantage of a relatively simple kind of law here to try to estimate those kinds of things. Okay. All right. So again, this was a thing that people used to do a whole lot more. There's a lot of people that have DEXA scanners now, so you just put you in the DEXA rather than this. In some ways, this is a lot like underwater weigh, but you don't have to actually go underwater, and it's going to be a little bit faster. Okay. All right, let's take a break until, I'll give you guys an 8-minute break. We'll take a break until 11:30. I'm going to run downstairs and grab a bioelectrical impedance thing if we've got one, and grab a skin hole caliper out of my lab, and then I will be back. Okay. All right, so we're recording again. All right. Nope, we can't see. What is that? So with DEXA, and I mentioned most of this kind of stuff to you guys earlier. The key takeaway from DEXA, okay? The key takeaway is that DEXA gives us bone mineral density data, okay? And so especially important is that it can give us bone mineral density at very specific locations, okay? And so ladies, you all probably need to have a DEXA scan done, every one of you, as soon as possible, so that we know what your bone mineral density is right now, because basically you've peaked, okay? You're as good as you're ever going to be from bone mineral density standpoint. That may not be 100% true, but it's close. And all you're doing now is hanging on until menopause. Yay, more fun things with childbirth, okay? You're going to hang on until menopause. After menopause, as your estrogen levels fall, then you're going to start losing bone mineral density. And that can put you at risk for something called osteoporosis. And so one of the ways that the primary way that we diagnose osteoporosis is by looking at bone mineral density in the hip, in the spine, okay, with DEXA. So if you have one now, you know where you are now. And then you've got a reference point basically from when you were at your best until a little bit later. We'll talk about osteoporosis. We'll do a day on musculoskeletal disorders and pathologies towards the very end of class. Okay. The other cool thing that it does is that it can give us regional data, right? Like it can tell us if Nikki's been doing a bunch of squats, if that's paying off in her right leg or her left leg, but not so much in her arm. So you can separate on the scan. You can pull out arms, right, or individual regions of the arms, upper leg, lower leg, midsection, and so you can actually track changes in muscle and fat and things down to the particular body segment where it might occur. Okay? The only problem with DEXA is, again, it's radiation. Okay? But it's so little radiation, you're going to get more radiation if you walk across campus today, just from being outside. You fly in an airplane, you get more radiation than you do. From being closer to the sun, you get more radiation than you get from a DEXA scan. It's very, very low levels of radiation. Okay? So if you want to get one of these done, if any of you guys, one of my grad students was doing a bunch of stuff looking at the relationship between DEXA-derived body composition and pain sensitivity. If any of you guys participated in that one, although I think Emma was the only person that had a DEXA. If you do all of those, we have to give women pregnancy tests. That's the standard on things here on campus for doing research. You have to take a pregnancy test beforehand. finally, last year, we had a woman that was pregnant and didn't know it. And so that was the first in my 8 years here. All those things. So my grad student was like, well, what am I supposed to do? I'm like, well, you need to tell her she's pregnant and she needs to go to the doctor and have another test done. We never heard back from her. We obviously didn't give her the DEXA scan. So on those kinds of things. So, but you have to do that because we want to make sure that in case you were pregnant, that you weren't getting additional radiation. You don't have a lot of choice when you walk across campus. You're going to get radiation. This is considered sort of an additional thing. So, okay. So DEXA, relatively fast. DEXA machines cost, I don't know, somewhere between $100,000 and $150,000, depending upon what features you're going to get. Most departments like ours now that are on most research or kind of research campuses have one. We have 2 DEXAs downstairs. Athletics has a DEXA, so we've got some that are going to be kind of readily available. So the accuracy is about plus or minus 3%. So they're very, very accurate. Okay. So we already talked about MRI. But I just figured I would show you guys this so you can have maybe a better understanding of the suffering that I undertook when I was a grad student. And I say suffering, it was mostly just out of boredom. MRI is very, very accurate. Okay? As I said earlier, of the indirect measures, MRI is clearly the best. Okay? Clearly the most accurate. Maybe like plus or minus 1%. But it's super expensive and the analysis is really, really labor intensive. So you would know, like the person lays in there and you would take these slices. If you want to know their whole body composition, you have to take a slice basically. Just cut them like in centimeter slices all the way up. What oftentimes happens if people do this is MRI is more reasonable for looking at muscle or fat mass or things like that at very kind of specific locations in the body. So like much of the stuff that I ever analyzed, we were just doing things in the quads. So we would just take from like the top of the patella up to the head of the femur. So we would do scans like that. On how tall you are, we might get 14 or 15 or 18 slices if you're really tall that were going to be there. And those scans would take, you know, half an hour or 45 minutes somewhere in there. But when you analyze them, what you guys can see here is here's a quad. This is the stake is taken at about mid-thigh and about the midpoint between the femur, the top of the femur and the top of the patella. What you see here in the middle, this is the femur. That white stuff is the fat. That's the bone marrow in the femur. But in this one, I circled all of the knee extensor muscles. Okay. And so what you do is we had an analysis program that you would circle these things, and then you would click a button, and it would look at the intensity or the color of that area. And so like we can see over here, we circled the whole thing, and the red is muscle. The yellow is considered adipose tissue. Doesn't know what the heck this stuff is down here around the femoral artery. And then there's just kind of this empty space that's going to exist between some muscles. To do it super accurately, you would want to circle all out here and around, get the subcutaneous adipose tissue. You want to get all this adipose tissue here. You'd circle each muscle individually and then add up all of those muscles. You got to do all of that for basically all of the quads, all of the hamstrings, all of your adductors and abductors, all the way up and down the femur, all the way up and down the body. Circle out the bone, circle out the bone marrow. You want to quantify the kind of mineral dense kind of black space here as well. So it's very, very labor intensive, but it's super duper accurate, super duper accurate. And so if you just care about how much bigger is your muscle getting, what's happening to subcutaneous adipose tissue, or we were very interested in this fat that is contained in the muscle and around the muscles on the inside and how that correlates to diabetes. Otherwise, we would have just done a DEXA or something else, just measure the circumference. Then it can potentially be labor intensive and accurate, but less of a problem. Okay. So here's some data from a weight loss study. It was published in the mid-90s. Here's an actual magnet. I know most of you guys have been in one. It probably looked like this. They're very loud and make all these weird clicking noises, right? And then it scans. It goes and those kinds of things. Not great if you're claustrophobic. If you don't mind sort of being stuck in there. The two of maybe the 3 or 4 like most painful experiences of my life have been in an MRI machine. when I was in high school. So this was long ago, well before Holocaust. Maybe not. So this is probably in when I was 15. So this would have been in like 1993. You guys were born. Y'all were not born in 93, were you? Oh, God. Okay. Nobody close to all of that as he hangs his head in sort of what has happened in my life when I've gotten old. Anyway, it was the early advent. So what we do now with a lot of these things, if you guys have them done, Matt, do they give you any kind of an infusion? Do they run a venous catheter and infuse some dye to try to, they're looking at the ligaments or something in your knee? Yeah, they did. They did an injection? They didn't, okay. So you can put dye in and it provides extra contrast on the imaging, okay? I also had one of these done. I didn't have my first migraine headache until I was like 33. And they wanted to check and make sure that I wasn't having like a stroke or anything, that I really was having a migraine because I had a history. And they inject stuff and it goes and it gets into the little blood vessels and the capillaries, and they can do brain imaging. They can make sure you don't have a bleed. But they can also use it to get extra contrast in certain areas in a joint or something like all of that. Well, this was a relatively new thing in 1993, back in the dark ages. And so this ridiculous radiologist had never done this before and was attempting to inject into my shoulder capsule this dye so they could try to get a better image of my rotator cuff. Okay? You guys know something about anatomy, right? To get into the shoulder capsule, you basically have to try to like pull the humerus down and almost kind of pull this out of the way. I'd already had a cortisone shot in there, which was super fun. Anybody had a cortisone shot in the shoulder? Nobody? Okay. Also fun, a nurse like basically pulled my arm out of socket while the physician, you have to be relaxed, and they inject the needle all the way through all of your delt muscles and these things down into the joint. You feel great afterwards, though. Let me tell you, cortisone is good stuff. Anyway, he's trying to get this big needle in to put the dye into my shoulder capsule. They gave me local anesthetic. That MFR was digging around for 90 minutes in my shoulder, trying to get it in. And he kept bumping the needle off the head of the humerus or off of the acromion. We got to the point where the local anesthetic is beginning to wear off. So I'm like feeling this. And then after all that, he's about to give up. And I sort of relax and I supinate, which if anybody knows what happens to the head of your humerus when you supinate, it turns and it opens up the joint. And I do one of these numbers and it goes right in, and then poof, we were fine. And of course, I hadn't torn my rotator cuff. All was well in my shoulder, but I had to have an idiot dig around, an idiot who's actually an MD and has lots of advanced training digging around in my shoulder with a big needle for about that long. That was one. My other experience was, so gosh, we had been here like a year. And this happens when you get old. I slept funny and pinched some nerves right where they exit the spinal column at C4, C5. Okay? The most excruciating pain I've ever experienced in my life in a lot of ways. You can't control it. Drugs don't work on it, like nothing. It runs down right along the edge of your shoulder, down your bicep, down the inside of your hand, down into my thumb. I still have numbness there. Terrible, awful pain. So they wanted to do imaging of all of this. They had to like cram me into this thing. And the way they had me stuck in the machine was in a way where it was really, really super painful. It was really aggravating, all of those things. And I had to sit in there for like 40 minutes where like I'm just sitting there and my neck is really, really, really hurting in a lot of ways. A little bit better if they just knocked my ass out and put me in the magnet on all of those kinds of things. To then find out that I have bone spurs and things from playing football in high school and smashing my face into other people, a bunch that are going to be there. So that's going to be a recurring problem for me. So those are the experiences in magnets that are going to be bad. But this is from a weight loss study. I don't really know why I told you all those stories. Now you know more things about me. Yay. But here's a person. These were some free images, and these are taken kind of from about right here to about right here, right over their kind of stomach. All right, well, it's really a little low for their stomach, but what we would think of in that way. And what they were wanting to quantify is, one, you can see the total sort of volume, kind of the circumference how much smaller they've got. These people did 6 months of 500 calorie a day caloric deficit, and they lost, like some of these folks lost, like 50 pounds and those kinds of things in 6 months on this. But you can see that overall they got smaller, but also they were very interested in what's happening in this subcutaneous adipose tissue, kind of right here, kind of right around your belly button. In a lot of ways, it's called visceral adipose tissue, and it's particularly indicative of your risk for cardiovascular disease and diabetes. Okay, so you can use it for these kinds of things. Although DEXA works pretty reasonable now. Okay, skin folds. Anybody ever had this done? Okay, McKenna, Daniel, did y'all do this in class or really? What class did y'all do it in? This semester? Last semester? Last spring? Fascinating. Okay.
I just did that last week in
personal training? Who's teaching personal training? Brian is? Okay. All right. Brian is more adventurous than I am in those ways. So these are skin fold calipers. These are expensive ones. These cost like $300 a piece. You guys probably used the big white plastic crappy ones that are like $5 that aren't super accurate. Good for you guys for having done it. We normally would do it in this class, but because of COVID, I don't really want you guys to feel in any way obligated to let someone get basically like right up in your grill on all of that. I'm less sensitive over that they're going to have to like grab you and pinch you on your stomach and your leg and your back and those kinds of places. That's, and if you want to be physical therapists and PAs and those kinds of things, that's just sort of stuff that we have to try to be adult about and just sort of get over. But so some of you have had this done, but this is a measure whereby we're going to pinch you and grab and measure the subcutaneous adipose tissue at these very strategic locations across your body. And then we're going to add all of those things up. And based upon that, we're going to estimate your body density. Okay. And then we're going to do some additional calculations from there to get your percent body fat. So it works like this. Everybody, if you are right-handed, put your left arm out in front of you. Okay. Zoomers, I want you all to do this too. Turn your cameras on so we can see. Put your left arm out. If you're left-handed, put your right arm out. So, okay. So put your non-dominant hand out. I then want you to take your dominant hand and I want you to use, you're going to pinch on your tricep. I want you to pinch up in your tricep muscle where you can feel it. Okay. Then while you've got a grip there, I want you to pull down while you squeeze. And you should feel the tricep sort of roll up. Okay. And what you're left with down here is subcutaneous adipose tissue, all right? Some of us, it's easier on than others because we have more subcutaneous adipose tissue, okay? So when you do this, that's the general thing. So the tricep is usually pretty easy. If you can relax, you can just feel the muscle kind of roll around. So we make that measurement, right? You would pinch in many ways like so, okay? And we make a measurement. That's telling me where I pinch that I have 18 millimeters out. Okay, no, I pulled more down. That's better. Okay. I mean, like 15 millimeters is the measurement there. Then you would grab someplace else. So like you could do here or something. Okay. The idea is to pull the skin out so that the sides are roughly parallel to each other, which depending upon one, how much adipose tissue there is at a particular location, and that individual location is going to be easier or more difficult depending upon where we are. Tricep is pretty easy, right, to do those kinds of things. Like the thigh is much more difficult. The abdominal one here tends to be much more difficult unless you've got somebody that is super, super lean. Just in places where we tend to have a little bit more adipose tissue, it's going to be a little more difficult. So the theory is that about somewhere between 1/3 to 2/3 of all body fat is going to be contained subcutaneously, right? And so there should be some sort of positive relationship between subcutaneous fat and total body fat. So if we measure the thickness at strategic locations where we think the body will tend to store fat, okay, then we can get an estimate from all of that of kind of what we think the total body fat is. So skin fold, even though it can be more accurate than a couple of our other methods, is something that we call a double indirect method. By being double indirect, what we mean is that we have to first estimate subcutaneous fat, then we use that estimate to estimate body density, okay? And then we use the body density to try to calculate percent body fat. So we're making two estimates on all of this. And so because of that, this measurement, if not done correctly, has a chance to essentially double our error because we're making two different estimates and two different assumptions on this one than we would with some of our other measures. Okay. However, if you are skilled at doing this, Daniel, you did it once. You feel like you're skilled at doing this now? Probably not. Okay. Did you have any reservations or concerns when you were pinching whomever you were making a measurement on? I did. Oh, you did it on yourself. Yeah. Wait, like, okay. Yeah. Is that so? Did everybody make any of you guys in class? Y'all did it on yourself? No. You did, Madison. You guys did it on each other?
Yeah.
Okay. So
I guess last semester was still like,
well, you know, the university cared last semester about social distancing. This semester, they're just like whatever, you're on your own, people. In the midst of all of that. So, but we're playing it extra cautious. Okay, we're not going to do it on yourself. There's going to be a lot of, you can get an idea of how it goes, but there's going to be more chance for error. But you may be like, hey, I don't even really know you. I just got paired up with you in class. I'm going to pinch you now. You know, maybe some reservations about kind of how that stuff's going to go. Okay, so. But it looks like this. You try to pull the skin out. We measure it. We're going to get a measurement in millimeters. We add them all together. We do some calculations. Okay. So generally, when we do skin folds, they're done across 7 sites. And I'll try to show you guys those sites as we kind of walk through them here. Okay. So the main calculation is on 7. Those 7 are the same between men and women. There's also a reduced method where we use only 3 measurements, but those 3 measurements are going to be different, or 2 of those 3 are going to be different between men and women, okay? And so they're going to reflect, the 3 site ones are going to reflect differences of where we think men and women tend to deposit fat. Okay? So the 7 sites are chest, tricep, abdominal, subscapular, suprailiac, mid-axillary, and thigh. Okay, so to measure all of these, chest is basically right here. You're going to pinch on the side of somebody's pec. Okay, and grab here. Tricep is just what we talked about. It's kind of the midpoint between acromion and elbow, right like so. Abdominal, you find your belly button, and you go just to the right side of the belly button. We're going to pinch right there. Okay, that one is not very fun. I don't like that one, not because of my fat tissue there, of which there's ample, but because that one hurts, I think. Subscapular, okay, wait. You want to see fun things with a guy that has a messed up shoulder? That's all the farther I can reach. So with that arm, subscapular, do this, put it back, and you're going to measure right here on the inferior angle of the scapula. Okay. Suprailiac, you find, I don't know why I always look up when I do this, but you find sort of the crest. Your iliac crest here, it's about right there, and it runs at a 45-degree angle, sort of down towards the inguinal fold. So it's basically like so, right across the top there. Mid-axillary is just right below your armpit, so right over your ribs, right here. Okay, and then thigh is midpoint of the head of the femur to the patella, so it's like right there. Thigh one also is one that tends to hurt a lot of people. You got to really try to grab over your rectus femoris there. Those are going to be our 7. When we just do men, we do chest, ab, and thigh. When we do women, it's just tricep, suprailiac, and thigh. So you've got a couple of upper body and a couple of lower body ones. That's kind of how we're going to do that. Okay. I'm going to give you guys a lab when we do lab 3, which I will assign next week. There may be some additional information in there about all of this, but we're not going to do it. What I'm going to do is you all are going to get a height and a weight, and and waist to hip, okay, ratio for me. You're going to give me your age. You're going to do the bioelectrical impedance, which we'll talk about in just a second. And based upon all of those numbers, I have like 5 years worth of 2 classes a year of lab data that we've been pooling together. It's all de-identified, but I will try to match you up with someone from a previous class as close as I can based upon your age, your height, your weight, okay, your BMI, your BIASS, body fat, and I'll give you some 7-site skin fold numbers. I'll give you some numbers, and then you can use those numbers to do the calculations. You get to practice the calculations, even though we know that those numbers won't really be that much of a reflection. Okay. Okay. Bioelectrical impedance. Yay. Looks sophisticated. It's really not. It's not super accurate. So here we have bioelectrical impedance. Right? We turn this bad boy on. It's got metal here and here. You hold it out in front of you like so. Runs the current into one arm. It goes through you, comes back down and collects on the other arm, and then it spits out percent body fat. Okay. Fat, bone, air-filled space do not conduct electricity. Muscle, which has lots of water in it and blood, are very conductive. And so it knows roughly what you weigh. It knows roughly how tall you are. It estimates your arm length based upon how tall you are. And then it figures out how long it takes that current to traverse. And from all of that, it guesses at basically what your fat and be. It's easy to trick this thing. Okay? It's easy to trick it. Drink a liter of water before you do it, and you suddenly have more muscle and less fat. If you hold your arms into your body close like so, and you suddenly have less fat and more lean tissue because it doesn't have to travel as far. If you are like me and you have baby T-Rex arms, because you're all midsection, I get helped on all of this because for my height, I have short arms. Okay? A lot of the guys and girls that are good basketball players have like extra long arms. Their wingspan is, normally you put your arms out, it's supposed to be roughly equal to how tall you are. Mine is not. Some people are like a foot more or a foot and a half more than how tall they are. They would be hurt by all of this because their arms are extra long for their height. So it's going to give you a rough estimate. It's not the most accurate thing in the world, but it works pretty reasonably. Okay, so those are our methods for quantifying things. Okay, those are our methods for quantifying body composition. The thing that's really important about all of this is knowing your body composition and knowing in many ways whether you have excess adipose tissue or not, even though we don't have numbers for all of that, is really important because it tells us a lot about your risk for chronic diseases and it tells us a lot about your overall health. Okay? When your body weight tends to exceed the normal or standard, whatever that means, weight for your person based upon your height, then you're going to be considered overweight and obese. And having excess weight compared to normal or standard for your height is going to have some level of increased risk for cardiovascular disease, certain kinds of cancer, type 2 diabetes, okay, arthritis, right? A host of different disorders. Okay? Now, the reason that we think that BMI works as well as it does, even though it is not really correlated with body composition very, very well, is that in an average person, if you weigh more than what we think the standard or normal weight should be, in most people, any excess weight on top of that generally tends to be adipose tissue. And people may have additional muscle mass insofar that they need that additional muscle mass to help them carry or move, right, that extra adipose tissue. And so, in a lot of people, the reason that it works is just because if you weigh more, most of that extra weight, whatever it is, quote unquote, is going to be That's the thing. And we think that it's not so much what you weigh, it really is having excess adipose tissue, especially excess adipose tissue in certain locations, that is the thing that predisposes you to a risk of cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, especially type 2 diabetes, arthritis, and plaque. Okay? So I know I mentioned this way back, like the very first couple of days of class. Here's some old data. They're going to only go through about 2000, so they're about 20 years old. But we're up to almost 75% now of adults in the US are considered to be overweight, which means they have a BMI of 25 or greater. Considered overweight, right? You will look, generally those numbers are a little bit higher in men than in women. And you will note kind of this general trend over time, like since the 60s, basically, we've just been getting more and more through every kind of 5 to 10 year interval in the midst of all of this. Okay. Ideally, that's going to stop at some point. Okay. So adults are considered people that are 18 and over on all of this. I hope that at some point it will kind of stop, and it won't just basically get where everybody is overweight. It's kind of leveled off a little bit the last couple of cycles, especially in women. Guys, we're not doing ourselves a lot of favors. A host of reasons why that's going to be the case. Okay, but by BMI, 3/4 of people are at increased risk for various chronic diseases. Okay? Not great. Not great. So about 1/3, depending upon the state in which you live, those numbers may be as high as 40 or 45%. Of the adult, about 1/3 of the adult population is obese. So, right, you've got overweight. So obese people are contained within all of this. And then BMI over 30, we're at about 33%. That's not gone up at quite the same kind of rate the last 20 years as it was doing from kind of the late 80s to about 2000. Yay, the internet. That was going on in the obese range, and that gap has also kind of closed a little bit. It used to be that by BMI, women were a little higher than men. Some of that was related to, obviously, sort of women tend to have greater body fat than men. Anyway, that gap has narrowed a little bit in the last little bit. Okay. This is important because if you go from being overweight to being obese by BMI, then you are going to, for a lot of those chronic diseases, especially type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure and things, you're going to like double your risk of everything. You're at a little bit of an increased risk if you're overweight. You're at a much larger risk if you are obese. And then we actually will take people that are obese, people that are over 30, and they have various categories of obese by BMI. There's like obese 1, obese 2, obese 3. And it's just kind of going all the way out to where you're going to see people, you know, that have a BMI of like, you know, maybe in the mid-40s or 50. So one of my master's students last year, so we collect data every couple of years. You guys can participate if you want, especially if you live in Texas, in the Dallas or the Houston area. It's called NHANES. It's the National Health and Nutrition and Exercise Survey. It's collected by the CDC, and it's collected every 2 years. What they do is they try to sample people, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks with research methods. They try to sample people to find people that are indicative of a certain age, a certain ethnicity, a certain education level, blah, 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 and you're going to be a representative person. So they get like 8,000 to 10,000 people every 2 years to take all of these things. And they use it to try to estimate the prevalence of obesity, different diseases, physical activity. Like you name a thing, they measure it in NHANES. If you go to the right site, you can get a DEXA scan, they'll do blood work, they do a whole bunch of different things. But she was doing some, and the data is all freely available. You go to CDC's webpage, you can download it, it's available to everybody in the entire world. And so they just get it and throw it out there and say, hey, if you're interested in this stuff, somebody look at this data and do some research with it. And so we had a couple of questions. And I was just going to tell you guys that she was looking at BMI. We were looking at a thing that in a couple of the years, they had things that were kind of pain-related questions. we were looking at body composition versus BMI on some pain stuff. You know, there are people in the sample that had BMIs in the 50s. That had BMIs in the 50s. And so, you know, these are things that you don't necessarily think about, maybe stuff being kind of that high. They can get to be really, really high. And that's going to have some really kind of bad health outcomes. Same kind of things, right? This, we don't have updated data, and I looked for some more of this at the start of class. We don't have good data in kids and adolescents. But similar to adults, right, the rates of overweight and obesity have gone up pretty significantly. Kids these days, although I don't know what I would call teenagers kids, but kids and adolescents on all of that. So we are just becoming overweight as a society, and it's basically killing us. Okay? So here's by map, self-reported rates of obesity. These are data from a couple of years ago, 2018. The darker, so red is the percentage of people in the state. There's more than 35% of people, of adults in the state are obese. Red is sort of 30 to 35. Yellow is 25 to 30. Colorado and DC and Hawaii are the only places that are under 25. All of that now. And so you can just look at what these things are. And again, it's going to track right here in the Southeast, through Kentucky, West Virginia, and Appalachia. I don't know what's going on in North Dakota. That's really strange. You guys can probably guess, right? Hawaii, Colorado, people tend to be very, very active, relatively high cost of living in those places. So socioeconomic status tends to be higher. I don't really know what's going on in DC. DC is its own complete animal. It makes no sense. I don't know if this is just people that live there, right, that are kind of permanent DC residents, or if it's people, lots of folks that are involved in politics and stuff that are there. Okay, so the interesting thing, I know I showed you guys these data once before, but I think it's important to highlight them again. Here is the same data, but this is for non-Hispanic white adults. Okay, so here's everybody, all right, same color code, all right. Here's non-Hispanic white, so here's Caucasians. All right, so if you look at this, a little bit less red. We've got a couple of other green places. California pops up in the midst of all of this. DC and Hawaii get even lower. And so what that would tell us in a lot of places is that minorities, okay, Hispanics, African Americans, tend to have higher rates of obesity than Caucasians. And if we look at all, I don't know that I have the thing here, but if people, the kind of least overweight and obese group is going to tend to be folks of sort of Asian or Pacific Island descent. Okay, here's non-Hispanic Black adults. So these are what we would traditionally think of as kind of African Americans, not necessarily folks that are Black, but are from, say, the Caribbean or someplace that are going to identify as Hispanic rather than sort of African in their descent. So you'll note all of this red that's going to be here. We don't have data in Idaho and South Dakota. That's because there's insufficient data. There are so few African Americans there. We don't have enough data. But again, right, you will look, as we do go through all of this, obesity is more prevalent in Black Americans than it is in any other ethnic or racial group. That's a concern. Okay, that's a concern for us. Okay. Here's Hispanics. Similar thing. Hispanics tend to be a little bit higher rates of obesity, not quite as high as African Americans, but higher than Caucasians in those ways. And that's also a concern. Okay. So we'll finish off just with a little bit of a thing on this, and we'll pick up the rest of this next week. Understanding obesity is really tricky. It's really difficult. Okay. There's a complex cluster of things that are going to contribute to people being overweight and obese. Okay. There are some health behaviors that are going to contribute. There's some genetics that are going to contribute. There's some environmental factors that are also potentially going to contribute to all of these things. There are people that have a genetic predisposition to obesity. Okay? If your parents are overweight or obese, you are at a heightened risk of being overweight or obese yourself. There's something about genes that are going to be involved in the midst of all of this that may lead to people per whatever they eat to store greater amounts of adipose tissue. There are things like physiological, psychological, and emotional trauma, all of which we know are related potentially to obesity, or they may be related to behaviors, right, like lack of exercise and physical activity and enhanced eating behaviors that may lead to greater levels of obesity. So you think about people that have any kind of psychological or emotional trauma, people that have been abused, people that have post-traumatic stress, whatever that's going to be, those kinds of things. It may even be things like this. Dr. Ober-Allen in our department, who's a health promotion faculty, is one of the things that Julie studies. Is she's very interested in some of the environment and behavior related kind of trauma and psychological trauma that has gone in with the African American population. Okay? There's the thoughts of sort of emotional and psychological or socioeconomic sense. You don't have to come from a place where you were abused or have post-traumatic stress or anything. There's just some things, right? Any of you guys who've been in the middle of a pandemic and a little more anxious than you normally were for like 2 years, and raise my hand in the midst of all of that. That is a thing that we know may have some subtle effects on physical activity, on diet, on hormone levels, and different things that may also. Okay, we'll pick up a little bit more about what this is on Monday of next week. Friday, I need your lab report by Friday. I'll get the Excel sheet posted hopefully by 1 o'clock today and get that up to you guys. Lab report then, aerobic exercise critique by next Wednesday. Okay? All right, good deal. Sorry. Yes, I'm sitting here. Let me check. Was it in the same email?
Yes, it was.